In this lecture, we're going to discuss the Opium Wars and their role in the Century of Humiliation. The root causes of the wars lay in the Western powers' disgruntlement at their treatment in China. Suspicions of foreign intentions led to significant restrictions on Western activity in China, including on where Westerners could live, proselytize, or even learn Chinese. In fact, there were laws in the late 18th and early 19th century that imposed capital punishment on Chinese who taught the language to foreigners. Most significantly, merchants were restricted to trading only in Canton, in what became known as the Kohong system. Kohong merchant guilds were the primary link between the government of the Qing dynasty and the rest of the world. It was unthinkable that Westerners would be allowed to set up diplomatic missions in the capital. In the 18th and 19th century, there was a tremendous demand for goods from China, especially porcelain, silk, and most of all, tea. Because the Kohong enjoyed a monopoly over the trade, they became among the wealthiest individuals in the world and fought hard to maintain Canton's status as the sole city where Westerners were allowed to trade. These restrictions rankled the British government, who sought out other ports of call through which to obtain the goods its empire craved. Also, because at the time the Western countries had few exports of interest to China, they had to pay for Chinese goods in silver, which drove the cost of silver sky high, causing the Western powers to suffer huge trade deficits. Before long, the British found that there was a tremendous demand for opium in China that was grown in the British colonies in Burma and South Asia. The Kohong guilds were happy to capitalize on this trade inside China, and by 1836 the opium trade had transformed China's trade surplus into a huge deficit. Opium surpassed silver as the most traded good between the English and the Qing dynasty by that time. Of course, the Chinese tried to put a stop to the importation of opium. Despite the Daoguang Emperor's many opium prohibition edicts throughout the early 19th century, trade in opium rapidly expanded, and by the late 19th century, scholars estimate that nearly a quarter of the adult male Chinese population was addicted to opium. Several prominent British members of Parliament argued against the ethics of the opium trade. Then future Prime Minister William Gladstone called the trade infamous and atrocious, and said he felt in dread of the judgments of God upon England for our national iniquity towards China. In 1839, the Emperor sent Viceroy Lin Zexu to Canton in an attempt to halt the opium trade. Lin confiscated all of the opium held in warehouses in Canton and ordered a blockade of foreign ships on the Pearl River. With echoes of the Boston Tea Party, Lin mixed the opium with lime and salt and threw it into the sea. After an intense debate in the UK and a close vote won by hawkish Foreign Minister Palmerston and his allies, the British government responded to Lin's actions by dispatching a military force to China. In the ensuing conflict, the Royal Navy used its superior naval and gunnery power in a series of decisive victories over the Qing forces. This gave rise to the term gunboat diplomacy. In 1842, the two sides signed the Treaty of Nanking, which was humiliating to the Chinese. First, it granted extraterritoriality to British subjects in China. Essentially, British people were not subject to Chinese law, but instead to local consuls. Second, it opened 5 treaty ports, Canton, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, to foreign merchants and missionaries. Third, it ceded Hong Kong Island to the British Empire. Other Western countries rapidly followed suit, securing their own rights in China based on the misnamed most favored nation principle, which actually meant equal treatment rather than most favored. Historians mark the Treaty of Nanking as the beginning of modern China, while China marks it as the beginning of the Century of Humiliation. A series of what came to be known in China as unequal treaties between foreign powers and the Qing government followed, granting similar rights for foreign powers in other Chinese cities, and this began the so-called slicing of the Chinese melon. The following 19th century editorial cartoons demonstrate the foreign competition to gain advantage in China. This image depicts the Queen of England, the Kaiser of Germany, the Tsar of Russia, Lady France, and the Japanese Emperor with knives drawn to get a slice of the Chinese pie, while the Chinese howling in protest are completely ignored. In this image, Uncle Sam has gotten into the act as well, as the nations dismember a Chinese dragon. A Russian Cossack dominates the scene and tells John Bull, representing the UK, that he may look, but not touch. In a similar scene, the same cast of characters is shown ripping China apart. The caption reads, "Poor John Bull. They screw you over and snatch the best pieces off your back. Get up quickly if you can." By this time, China seems to be completely irrelevant to the contest for influence within its own borders. After the Treaty of Nanking, foreigners were still unsatisfied because their activities were confined to treaty ports, and they did not have access to the capital. This led to the Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860. A famous episode in the Second Opium War illustrates the misunderstanding between the West and China, and is still held up by the Chinese as an example of Western barbarism, and is a key event in the century of humiliation. In 1860, with Anglo-French forces marching on Beijing, 2 British envoys, a journalist for the Times, and a small escort of British and Indian troops were sent ahead to meet Prince Yi under a flag of truce to negotiate a Qing surrender. When the French and British troops reached the palace, they discovered that the negotiation delegation had been imprisoned and tortured, resulting in 20 deaths. Lord Elgin was then serving as the British High Commissioner to China, and retaliated by ordering the complete destruction of the Summer Palace, a private 860-acre personal estate of the Qing emperors, which was called the Garden of Gardens. Elgin calculated that this act, narrowly targeted at the Qing ruler's opulent pleasure palace and built on the backs of the average Chinese, would be popular among the Chinese people, who at the time were increasingly opposed to Qing rule. Unfortunately, Lord Elgin couldn't have been more wrong. It took 4,000 men 3 days of burning to destroy the palace, and many exquisite artworks, sculptures, porcelain, jade, silk robes, elaborate textiles, gold objects, and more were stolen and are now found in 47 different museums around the world. The sacking of the Summer Palace remains a sensitive issue even today. Elgin's miscalculation was that the Chinese populace wouldn't care because the palace had been built on their backs with heavy taxes and corvée labor, and none of them got to enjoy it anyway. But the palace was so exquisite that it had become a symbol of national pride, much like the Great Wall or the Forbidden City. In the 1980s, the ruins were reopened as a public park to commemorate China's national wound. It is still a matter of public policy to reclaim the looted relics, and many wealthy Chinese have purchased them and brought them back to China, including the famous fountainheads depicting the 12 animals in the Chinese zodiac, 8 of which have now been returned to China at enormous expense. Exhibitions of partial recreations of the Summer Palace and its legendary fountains have been hugely popular in the park, and pointed reminders of the barbarism of the foreigners. At the conclusion of the conflict, Prince Gong, a younger half-brother of the emperor, was forced to sign the Convention of Beijing with the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. Although Russia had not been a belligerent, it threatened to weaken China with war on a second front. The British, French, and Russians were granted permanent diplomatic presence in Beijing, something the Qing Empire had resisted to the very end, as it suggested equality between China and the European powers. Britain acquired the Kowloon Peninsula next to Hong Kong. The opium trade was legalized, and Christians were granted full civil rights, including rights to own property and evangelize. This forced opening from the West exacerbated other internal challenges the Qing dynasty was facing and led to its collapse, which we'll cover in our next lecture.